Well, our Campaign Friday journalists join me now for a look at the top stories of the day. Susan Delacourt's a columnist and parliamentary bureau chief for the Toronto Star. Michelle Zilio is a political reporter with the Globe and Mail. And Vanmala Subramaniam is a reporter with the National Post. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Thanks, let's start with the big climate marches today. And I'm wondering, Susan, let me start with you. What effect do you think they'll have on the campaign, if any?
We were always told this was going to be the climate change election. But I think for there to be this to be an election, there has to be sharp divides between them, and the leaders, from the podiums at least, maybe not in their platforms, are trying their best to blur distinctions between them. They're attacking each other, but I think Canadians really have to dive into the platforms of each of them to find out where they're different, except the Greens, of course.
Yeah, and do you think we're there, Michelle? Do you think we're at a place yet where this issue occupies enough oxygen and space in the campaign that people will dive into the platforms and say, okay, I better get my head around this, I want to know more?
I think if we were heading to the polls this coming Monday, then this probably would be one of the defining issues. It still could be, but it's just so early on and campaigns can change so quickly. The one thing I would say is that there is a lack of detail here, and if Canadians are really going to dive into this climate change issue as a voting issue, what they will discover is that all of the parties are saying we're trying to meet the 2030 climate commitments through the Paris Accord, but there's not a lot of detail on that. So again, there's that divide of just not knowing who to vote for because the policies appear to be so similar when you get down to the details.
And there seems to be a lot, as I watch the campaign unfold, there's a lot of this sort of trying to do one better than, one party we'll talk about in a minute that's not really in the do one better game. But let's all do one better, and yet Canadians hear all this against the backdrop of so far, no one's meeting the targets. We're falling short of what we promised we would do anyway. It's successive governments. So how does that frame the conversation? What are people supposed to think of that?
Well, I think there's a lot of nuance, right, when you talk about climate issues, and I think a lot of voters are not picking up on that nuance because it's quite a complicated issue, right? And I think, the big divides are obviously people who don't think that the oil and gas industry is really an issue and that there's technology like carbon capture and carbon storage that will be able to kind of offset the emissions. So that's one camp. And then the other camp is people who maybe don't know a lot about this but feel that, yeah, I think we have an issue, but then again, the Liberals, seem to be doing something about it. They've said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, maybe we'll go there. And the NDP is saying that they'll do that even quicker than 2050. So, it's really hard to distinguish between, you're clear on where you stand if you vote, if you are conservative leaning on this issue. But if you're not, then it's really difficult to kind of figure out. And I think there's a generational gap here. So I think older people don't care, not to say don't care, but are not as engaged in the issue as younger people. And I think that's going to make the difference.
Certain level of tone deafness here. I find myself watching the demonstrations today and talking to young people today about this, and they're all talking about the need for Canadians to pull together and parties to work together, and then as soon as they get the opportunity, the party leaders slam all the platforms of the other party leaders, and then we're back to, well, okay, you have to pick one option over the other because doesn't seem to be any desire to work together.
Yeah, it's funny. I watched, I guess a few weeks ago, everything feels like it was years ago before this election, the Democratic debate in the U.S. over climate change, and they were all emphasizing an issue like this does require collaboration, and not just working internally in your country, but working with other countries as well. That, the whole thing about the Paris Accords, are they a bunch of countries? And collaboration is a really hard sell in an election that's about competition.
Right.
So we've got, it's very hard to go out there and say, I'll work with people when you're trying to defeat them. So, Kim Campbell famously said elections are no time to talk about policy, but they may be no time to talk about collaboration either, unless you're talking like Elizabeth May is, which is, let's talk about minority parliament.
Right.
Let's talk about having an institutional way to make sure we work together, which may be the result of this
Michelle, what do you think?
campaign.
I think that the lead up to this point on Friday with these hundreds of thousands of Canadians taking to the streets is we were hearing policy, policy, policy from the parties, and they were looking very similar. But today, everything was about optics. The fact that all of the major party leaders were taking to these marches, except Mr. Scheer, was very interesting. And I think for young people, that could be something that really stands out for them when they go to the polls. Maybe somebody who doesn't dive into a platform document but says, I remember the Conservative leader didn't show up. But that would also stand out for people in Alberta, where oil and
Yeah,
gas
who
is a
think he
very
shouldn't be
major
showing
voting
up.
issue.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's interesting too, right? I mean, let me frame it this way. So who do you think took the bigger risk today? Justin Trudeau by showing up because, or Andrew Scheer by not showing up? Because there were some people screaming at Justin Trudeau at the march and so on. But as Andrew Scheer pointed out, great, he shows up at a demonstration against his own policies. And so, but by the same token, Andrew Scheer doesn't show up. Who took the bigger risk?
I think Scheer took the bigger risk, and I'll say this because if you just look at voting patterns across the country, the captured vote for Scheer are people who don't really care about climate change as an issue. He has those votes. Those people don't really have an alternative. And so for him, what he's trying to do to even from a minority government is trying to get the rest of that vote, right? Like people who maybe are not so aware about the issue, but they don't understand the importance of the oil and gas sector. And so I think by him not showing up, that kind of doesn't figure to me, because I would ask, what are you doing to get the rest of the people who have an opinion on this into your fold, who might be fiscally conservative,
Yeah, and then on the other hand, Justin Trudeau is trying to, this is the fishing from which pool argument, right? So Andrew Scheer needs to fish from a pool of people kind of in the middle who are prepared to vote Conservative, and Justin Trudeau needs to go get all the progressives he might have had last time and try to get them back on side, right?
Yeah, because I don't think he's going to get the Conservatives. I agree with Michelle, though, too, and that the platforms don't say much. I was actually surprised to see how little the Liberals are saying about this, or even pharmacare this week. It's sort of...
Well, they're sending kids to camp.
That's right.
They're planting trees.
That's right, yes.
Not diminishing those things, but
yeah, I'm surprised with, they had the election timing in their hands, and how little is there except elect us and, cross your fingers that we'll be better.
Well, then Minister McKenna admitted that this week, right?
Yeah.
Saying, we don't have details.
We know there needs to be more.
But get us into government first, and then we'll let you know how it goes. Well, we're going to learn a lot more, I think, this Sunday. That's what we're expecting when the platform comes out.
Right.
But sorry, just to add on this, I think the Liberals and the Conservatives are the Liberals are doing this thing where they're just dancing around the oil and gas issue, right? They're not exactly coming out and saying, hey, in order to become a carbon neutral country by 2050, we actually have to essentially get rid or completely transition the oil and gas industry, and they don't want to actually come out and say that. So the platform that they're giving out is just bits and pieces of, we think we can do this by this point, but really the elephant in the room is, hey, the biggest carbon emitters in this country is that industry. So
yeah, and they're the part of the Progressive Party that is actually trying to make that argument and stay with it. That you can have you can own a pipeline, and you can still fight climate change, and that seems to
really
be
hard sell.
Certainly for the audience they were trying to talk to today, right?
Yeah, the middle is a really hard place to be in any kind of political discussion right now too. The world Twitter wants to force people into their corners at least. But during this election, that's a very hard sell.
Michelle, what are your overall impressions of where we are in the campaign now? We're in a week, almost, 2.5. We're into week 3 here.
I think we're on day 16.
We're on 17, I think.
Day 17.
Right. Yes. What are your impressions of where we are and how the campaign's unfolding?
Well, I think the story of the campaign so far has been this revelation that Mr. Trudeau dressed up in blackface and brownface. I was on the campaign plane when that happened, and it felt very intense. But then getting out onto the main streeting with the Prime Minister, with the Liberal leader the next day, really saw, how the Canadian public was reacting to that. So I think think that is the moment so far, but I'm not seeing a major issue yet. Again, like I said, if the polls, we were going to the polls on Monday, climate change might be it. But in the last election, 2015, we saw the refugee issue of Syrian refugees really take over the narrative of the campaign about partway through. So we still got time, we still got debates, and there's lots more to go.
Vanmala?
Yeah, I think that, after the blackface, brownface issue came out, the Liberals lost a lot of their ammunition. They were probably sitting on a pile of, Oppo research that they had wanted to use, but they couldn't use. To roll out about Conservative candidates. Right, because they would come across as hypocrites, right? And that kind of took away from what they could do. And so in response to that, they just put out big things like ban on, the gun assault ban, and the climate change carbon neutral policy. So I think the reason why they did this is because they wanted to go the opposite direction and stay as far clear on issues of race that I thought in the beginning of the campaign would be immigration and race would be something that was discussed more, but I think they've just purposely stayed away from it after the blackface thing.
Susan, where are we? What kind of a campaign does it feel like to you? And if you're, we see the polls basically not moving, a little bit, percentage up or down either way with Conservatives and Liberals, and to this point, I'm talking to David Coletto earlier, no real defining issue yet for people.
No, I went door to door in Toronto this week in a couple of polls, and people knew that there was an election on. But they all had different issues at the door. There wasn't a ballot box question at the door. As many people were annoyed by the blackface controversy as were, by annoyed I mean, why all
Distracted.
This fuss? And
annoyed as offended.
Yeah. And as we're bringing it up, there wasn't a clear, again, I'm not sure Toronto is representative, but it was a couple of representative ridings, and it was so different, the issues at the door. So I don't think, the famed narrative has emerged, and I don't know that it's a change election yet. I don't get that sense out there yet, but as Michelle said, it didn't happen until, the Liberals didn't know they were going to win the last election until the last 5 days of a very long campaign in 2015. So I think anything can happen.
Still more than 3 weeks to go. Thank you all.
No.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.